The quietest corner of the city belongs to a waitress whose shyness is a fortress. Her world collides daily with the boss, a man whose silence carries the weight of death. He rules the diner from a back booth, flanked by stone-faced soldiers. When the boss brings his aging, profoundly deaf mother, the routine shatters. The armed men, masters of intimidation, are helpless, paralyzed by the need for simple communication. The invisible waitress sees past the fear. She steps into the tense silence. Her hands begin to move, flowing in a practiced, intimate language the crew doesn't understand. Every hardened man in the booth, including the boss, freezes. This silent exchange, this unexpected key, redefines her in the eyes of a man who controls everything. The air inside the Copper Kettle diner always tasted slightly of stale coffee and profound, unspoken fear. It was a familiar duality to Eleanor Hayes, 32, whose life revolved around this predictable, worn setting in the quiet, small suburban town of Oakhaven Springs. Eleanor was highly competent, her movements precise and quick, yet she was shielded behind her practical spectacles, which seemed designed to minimize the impact of her perpetually tired, observant eyes. Her world was defined by the rhythm of the lunch rush and the profound silence emanating from the diner's most infamous alcove, the back booth, commonly referred to by the local staff, terrified and whispering, as the throne. It was here that Marcus the Brick Donovan, 45, had established his unofficial headquarters. Marcus was a man carved from granite and tailored darkness. His suits were impeccable, and his intense blue eyes rarely blinked, giving him the appearance of a predator eternally mid-stalk. A faint, silvered scar was visible just above his left jawline, a silent testament to a previous, successful conflict. Marcus was ruthless, calculating, and intensely private, ensuring that every living soul within the diner understood the necessity of absolute obedience. Every day, the ritual was the same. Eleanor would approach the throne, place a fresh coffee black, no sugar, served at exactly 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and retreat. The interactions were transactions, not conversations. Marcus never acknowledged her beyond a slight dip of the chin. Today, however, the routine fractured the moment the diner door opened. Instead of the usual phalanx of 3 armed men, Marcus entered with 4, and between 2 of them walked an entirely unexpected figure. Beatrice Donovan, 78, was silver-haired and frail, yet she carried herself with an old-world dignity that seemed utterly out of place among the chrome and vinyl of the diner. She wore a heavy wool coat despite the mild weather, and a constant, slight frown etched itself across her face, a look of quiet internal frustration. This was Marcus' mother, known only in hushed rumors outside the Donovan estate, the Keep, a heavily fortified mansion secluded outside of town. The crew, usually machines of intimidation, were instantly rendered awkward. They treated Beatrice with a distant, almost fragile respect, clearly uncomfortable with the domesticity she represented. Marcus pulled out the booth seat for his mother with a strained formality, an action Eleanor had never seen him perform. Beatrice settled in, gazing around the brightly lit diner with a mixture of curiosity and that persistent, subtle impatience. Eleanor watched from the counter, gripping a coffee pot handle until her knuckles whitened. This was not the usual terror. This was a novel, confusing disruption. The crew members positioned themselves strategically. Silas Vance, 36, positioned closest to the kitchen entrance. Silas, built like a linebacker with a meticulously maintained buzz cut and a perpetually expressionless face, was the epitome of Donovan's discipline. He was intimidating, a silent monolith of muscle, but now Eleanor could sense the deep discomfort radiating from him. He was completely out of his depth in a non-violent situation, requiring simple courtesy. Marcus addressed his mother. His voice, usually a low, authoritative rumble, softened marginally. To Beatrice, "Well, have the usual, Ma. A little water first." Beatrice looked directly at him, a focused intensity in her eyes, but she did not respond. A little louder, "Water, Ma. Ice water." Beatrice blinked once, slowly, then shook her head dismissively, waving a delicate hand toward the menu. She seemed annoyed, not by the suggestion of water, but by the volume or repetition. Eleanor, remembering the rumors that had surfaced when Beatrice had first arrived in Oakhaven Springs a month prior, felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. Profoundly deaf. The men surrounding her, used only to giving orders or extracting compliance through force, were completely unprepared for the simple necessity of communication. Marcus sighed, a sound that held immense frustration, but also a deep-seated protective tenderness he usually reserved for crushing rivals. He motioned to Silas. "Silas, get her something. Anything. Make sure she understands." Silas Vance's expressionless facade momentarily cracked, replaced by a flicker of sheer panic. His massive hands, more accustomed to disarming threats than fetching tea, grasped the back of the booth. Silas leaned toward Beatrice, his imposing shadow engulfing her slightly. He spoke in a loud, measured tone, articulating each syllable with unnatural stiffness. Shouting slowly, Beatrice recoiled slightly, her persistent frown deepening into clear displeasure. She tapped the side of her ear pointedly, then used her hands to make a frustrated, sweeping gesture, pushing the sound away. She then pointed emphatically at the menu section detailing the soup of the day, hoping the visual cue would bridge the gap. Silas froze. The visual cue was clear, but the necessary conversational bridge to confirm the order was entirely missing. He glanced frantically at Marcus, his immense discipline crumbling into utter helplessness. His training had not prepared him for this level of gentle, non-aggressive communication. The other two bodyguards shifted nervously, equally useless. The silence in the back booth, usually heavy with threat, was now simply heavy with awkwardness and failure. They could subdue a crowd, dismantle a car, or vanish a person, but they could not order a 78-year-old deaf woman a cup of soup. Beatrice sighed, a sound of profound, weary resignation. She lowered her head slightly, staring down at her hands in her lap, her pride clearly wounded by the spectacle of confusion she was causing. Eleanor watched the elderly woman. Beneath the fear that normally paralyzed her, an unexpected surge of empathy rose. She recognized that look, the quiet isolation of being surrounded by sound, yet utterly cut off. In a split-second decision that annihilated years of ingrained shyness and fear of drawing attention, Eleanor moved. She did not speak, did not ask permission, did not even think about the potentially lethal consequences of injecting herself into the Donovan family's personal crisis. She walked directly toward the back booth. Her movements were smooth, automatic. She reached the table and placed the coffee pot down gently, then centered herself in Beatrice's line of sight. Marcus looked up, ready to issue a sharp dismissal, or perhaps a lethal warning. His intense blue eyes snapped onto her, and the tension ratcheted up so sharply that Eleanor could feel the hair standing up on her arms. But Eleanor didn't meet his gaze. She focused entirely on Beatrice Donovan. Without speaking a word aloud, Eleanor Hayes raised her hands. Her movements were fluid, graceful, and deeply practiced. Her hands moved with an expressive elegance that belied the clumsiness of the thick diner uniform. She signed, "Hello. Welcome. My name is Eleanor. Are you frustrated? Can I help you order?" The effect was instantaneous. Beatrice Donovan's eyes, which had been downcast in quiet despair, flew up. The deep frown instantly dissolved, replaced by a shock of pure, joyous relief. She smiled, a genuine, warm, grandmotherly smile that illuminated her whole face, and immediately signed back, "Yes, thank you. I am very frustrated. No one understands." Eleanor responded instantly, a low hum of sound escaping her throat, the way some signers vocalize slightly beneath the pure visual language. Every single member of Marcus Thorne's crew froze. The three bodyguards standing near the kitchen entrance became statues, their arms dropping slightly, their eyes locked on the mesmerizing dance of Eleanor's hands. Silas Vance, the rigid enforcer, stood rooted to the spot, his mouth slightly ajar, completely paralyzed by the sight. He was watching the visual equivalent of an explosion in their carefully controlled world. The terrifying silence of the back booth had returned, but this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of absolute, bewildered astonishment. Marcus Thorne himself stopped mid-sentence. He had been about to sharply tell Eleanor to get back to the counter, but the words died on his tongue. His intense gaze, a gaze that usually analyzed threats and calculated retaliation, was utterly locked on Clara's spectacles and the rapid, intimate conversation happening between his mother and the shy waitress. The movement of her hands, signing, "Do you want the tomato basil soup?" was the most dangerous, influential act performed in that diner since Marcus had claimed the booth as his own. Beatrice, oblivious to the frozen tableau of hardened men around her, nodded enthusiastically, signing back with quick, satisfied motions. "Yes, soup," And black coffee. Strong. Like my son drinks. Is that possible? Eleanor smiled softly. A genuine small smile that vanished quickly, but not before Marcus saw it. Perfectly possible. I will bring it right away. She finished the exchange, dipping her head slightly to Beatrice, then turned to leave. As she pivoted, her eyes finally momentarily swept across Marcus. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stared. A million calculations running behind those intense blue eyes. The barrier between their two worlds, the world of order pads and the world of organized crime, had just been obliterated by a silent language. The sheer volume of what her silent language had communicated was immense. Competence, compassion, and a hidden history that made her utterly unique in his world. Eleanor walked back to the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting the immediate wrath of a man whose authority had been challenged by an act of quiet service. But the wrath didn't come. Silas Vance slowly exhaled, sounding like a collapsing balloon. He glanced at Marcus, waiting for direction, for the usual cold command. Marcus didn't issue one. He only moved his hand, slightly, indicating the crew should stand down. The message was clear. No one interferes. Marcus leaned back in the booth, his customary stony demeanor slightly unsettled. He watched Eleanor as she prepared the soup bowl and poured the coffee. He wasn't watching the waitress. He was watching the interpreter, the unexpected confidant of his mother. He hadn't been able to communicate with his mother on that level for years, relying instead on shouted repetitions and written notes that only aggravated her pride. This painfully shy woman, hidden behind her spectacles, had just succeeded where all his power and resources had failed. The waitress, Eleanor Hayes, was no longer invisible. She was now a pivotal and potentially dangerously influential figure in his complicated world. Her quiet resilience, long suppressed, had just found its voice in silence. The brick was frozen, contemplating the new architecture of his environment. Eleanor placed the soup and coffee carefully in front of Beatrice, signing a final "enjoy your meal," before retreating fully behind the counter, forcing herself to resume the frantic choreography of the lunch rush. Beatrice looked up at her son, her expression now content and slightly mischievous. She sipped her coffee, then signed a quick, simple thought to Marcus, knowing full well he couldn't understand the nuance of the sign, but relying on the context of the situation. "She's a good girl, Marcus. Keep her close." Marcus stared at his mother, then back at Eleanor's retreating figure. He understood the sentiment, if not the precise words. He lifted his own black coffee, his eyes never leaving the waitress. The realization settled in him, heavy and absolute. The dynamics of power in Oakhaven Springs had just shifted, not through a gunshot, but through the graceful movement of hands, asking about tomato basil soup. The world of Marcus Donovan, built on fear and intimidation, now depended, subtly and dangerously, on the kindness and unique skill of the shy woman in the spotless diner uniform. His control was absolute, yet here, in the heart of his territory, a gentle vulnerability had been exposed, protected only by the silence of American Sign Language. The lesson was stark. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in the language least heard. The air in the Copper Kettle Diner, thick with the smell of brewing coffee and the lingering tension of the preceding minutes, seemed to warp around the back booth. Eleanor, having delivered the meal, felt the familiar tremor of fear, yet it was complicated now, laced with a strange, fleeting triumph. She had acted purely, instinctively, and the result was chaos in a controlled world. Behind the counter, Eleanor forced her hands to move with their accustomed speed, but her mind was fixed entirely on the rigid tableau at the throne. Marcus, utterly motionless, absorbed the sight of his mother Beatrice enjoying her soup. The immediate, genuine relief on Beatrice's face, a warmth Marcus rarely saw directed at himself or his staff, was a physical punch. It told him everything about his previous failure and Eleanor's sudden, unexpected success. He finally broke the silence, raising his coffee cup to his lips. The action was slow, deliberate, a calculated return to routine. Silas, still stationed near the kitchen, shifted his weight. His usual expressionless mask had returned, but his eyes betrayed a profound disorientation. Silas understood physical dominance, leverage, and the cold geometry of threat assessment. He was prepared for an ambush, a shooting, a sudden riot. He was completely unprepared for the sudden intimacy of silent communication, rendering him obsolete. He glanced at Marcus, waiting for the command, the signal to dismiss, punish, or simply eliminate the source of the disruption. But Marcus gave no signal. He merely studied Eleanor as she moved behind the counter, her movements now imbued with an unwelcome significance. She was no longer just a shadow, she was a focal point. Marcus leaned toward Beatrice, his voice dropping to the low conversational register he maintained when conducting sensitive business, yet laced with unusual curiosity. To Beatrice, speaking slowly, clearly, "She knows the language, Ma. Did she learn it well?" Beatrice looked up, a faint smile playing on her lips, and signed back with the familiar, quick elegance that Eleanor had displayed. "Excellent. Better than the teachers at my old school." Marcus watched his mother's hands, trying desperately to decipher the fluid movements, but the language remained an unbreakable code, accessible only to the waitress. He felt a sharp jab of jealousy, quickly suppressed and replaced by cold, pragmatic calculation. The waitress wasn't a threat. She was a resource, a highly specialized, potentially dangerous resource. He placed his cup down, the click louder than necessary. The movement was final. To Eleanor, the command low and absolute waitress. Front and center. Now. Eleanor froze, the wet rag clutched in her hand. The moment of reckoning had arrived. She wiped her palms on her apron, adjusted her practical spectacles, and forced herself to walk toward the throne a second time. This was not a request for a refill. This was a summons to the court of Oakhaven Springs' quiet tyrant. When she reached the booth, Marcus gestured with a minute movement of his finger, indicating she should stand closer, right beside the table, exposed between him and Silas. The three bodyguards in the perimeter tightened their posture. Silas was a wall of disciplined muscle behind her. Eleanor could feel the heat radiating off his immaculate suit, the palpable alertness of a man who existed only to react to danger. Marcus did not look at her eyes, but at her hands, the hands that had just performed an act of immense power. Quietly, intensely, sit. It was not a question. Eleanor hesitated for a moment. Sitting with him violated every unspoken rule of their previous dynamic, then slowly slid onto the edge of the vinyl bench opposite him, still facing Beatrice, but with her gaze fixed on Marcus. She sat rigidly, hands folded in her lap, feeling the overwhelming weight of his presence. "You broke protocol. You drew attention to yourself. Do you understand the consequence of drawing my attention?" Eleanor nodded once, minimally. "I do." "Then explain. Why risk it for tomato basil soup?" Eleanor took a shallow breath. Fear was a familiar roommate, but she wouldn't let it shake her integrity now. She looked past Marcus at Beatrice, who was peacefully focused on her meal, her voice gaining a low, firm resonance. She was frustrated, alone. That feeling, being surrounded by sound, by people trying to help and still being isolated, it's debilitating. It was instinct. I needed to help her understand. Marcus studied her face. He was searching for calculation, for a hint of manipulation, but found only exhaustion and quiet conviction. Instinct. That is a luxury we do not afford ourselves. Where did you learn to sign? Eleanor's gaze dropped slightly, focusing on the dark wood grain of the table. The admission was raw, intimate. It revealed not only a skill, but a history of deep, empathetic connection. Marcus processed this information clinically, cross-referencing it with the known facts about Eleanor, her immaculate efficiency, her extreme shyness, her avoidance of all eye contact. He realized her spectacles weren't just practical. They were a shield, protecting eyes that were used to communicating volumes without speaking. A low exhale, a secret language. Interesting. He shifted his gaze back to Beatrice. The usual strained silence was gone, replaced by a comfortable domesticity fueled by Eleanor's brief intervention. "My mother, she lost her hearing later in life, a consequence of an accident years ago. We tried tutors, electronic aids, everything. She is proud, stubborn. She rejects the attempts to fix her, the shouted, clumsy efforts of my men. She retreated. He didn't need to explain further. Eleanor understood. The deafness wasn't just a physical ailment. It was a wall built of pride and misunderstanding. Leaning closer, his intensity ratcheting up, "You have access to a part of my world that is completely impenetrable to me. That makes you valuable, Eleanor, incredibly valuable. And because you are valuable, you are also vulnerable." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat and promise. Value in Marcus' world was a guarantee of protection, but also a leash. From this moment forward, you will not simply serve coffee, you will be available for my mother. Whenever she is here, or whenever I require you, you will interpret. You will be the bridge. Eleanor felt the tightening knot in her stomach. Her life was quiet, routine, predictable. Now she was officially a functional part of the Donovan infrastructure, tethered to the man who ruled Oakhaven Springs through fear. And if I refuse? The tension in the booth intensified to a razor's edge. Silas behind Eleanor made a minute involuntary movement, a barely audible rustle of expensive fabric, anticipating the consequences of her temerity. The surrounding bodyguards went entirely still. Marcus looked directly into her eyes for the first time. Intense, calculating blue meeting the wary brown hiding behind the glass. A chilling smoothness, devoid of anger. You won't refuse, because my mother is happier now than she has been since she arrived in this town. And you understand what isolation feels like, don't you? You didn't step forward for me, Eleanor. You stepped forward for her. And I will ensure that the safety of the good person who chose to help my mother becomes paramount to you. The message was clear. Refusal meant not only her demise, but the shattering of Beatrice's newfound comfort, leveraging Eleanor's empathy against her safety. Quietly, accepting the grim reality, I understand. I will help, Beatrice. A slight, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction. Good. He withdrew slightly, leaning back, the tension momentarily easing. He reached into his inner suit pocket and withdrew a small, folded stack of bills, far more than her weekly salary. This is a retainer for your new duties. Keep your silence, keep your focus, and keep my mother communicating. Eleanor didn't touch the money. She only looked at his hands, remembering the swift, lethal efficiency she knew they possessed. I don't need the money. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the cash. You refuse payment? Everyone takes payment, Eleanor. I helped your mother because she needed help, not for payment. If I take money, it becomes a transaction. If it's a transaction, it's conditional. This answer, delivered with quiet, unyielding dignity, startled Marcus more than a physical attack would have. She was defining the terms of the relationship, not with force, but with moral leverage. She had just forced him to acknowledge that her service was a gift, not a commodity he could simply purchase. He slowly pulled his hand back, leaving the money resting on the table. A flicker of respect in his eyes. It is always a transaction, Eleanor. Learn that. But for now, keep your unique currency. He then presented the first, crucial test, the moment that truly solidified her dangerous new role. My mother has been worried about my father. I haven't had the heart to tell her that. Things are resolved. In my line of work, resolution is rarely peaceful. She needs to understand that she is safe. I can't write it down. The words would alarm her. Tell her. This was the climax. Marcus was asking her to translate not just language, but the brutal, veiled truth of his life. He was demanding that she act as his emotional shield, his confidant in a zone of ultimate vulnerability. Eleanor shifted her gaze to Beatrice, who was wiping her mouth with a napkin. This was the moment where she crossed the professional line forever. Eleanor turned to Beatrice and raised her hands, the movements precise, delicate, translating the weight of Marcus' unspoken burdens. Beatrice, your son wants you to know that the troubles concerning your husband, Marcus' father, are finished. The situation has been completely handled. You are safe here, and you are loved. Do you understand? Beatrice's eyes softened, filling slightly with tears that she quickly brushed away with the back of her hand. Her hands moved swiftly, communicating a history of worry and relief that transcended the simple words. I worried so much. Marcus never speaks plainly. Tell him thank you. Tell him I know he carries too much weight, and that his hard work is appreciated. Tell him to rest. Eleanor paused, turning her gaze back to Marcus, relaying the message not as a direct quote, but translating the intent and the underlying emotion. To Marcus, her voice low, she said that she worried intensely, but she thanks you. She knows you bear a heavy burden, and she is grateful for your work. She asks you to find rest. Marcus received the translated sentiment like a physical blow. He stared at Eleanor, the layers of calculation momentarily stripped away. He hadn't heard such unfiltered maternal devotion in years. It was a truth delivered by an unsuspecting messenger. He glanced at Silas, whose eyes were fixed on the exchange, though he understood none of it. Silas was ready for violence. He was completely unable to process the tenderness in that moment. A gruff whisper, Tell her I will try, and that I'm glad she is here." Eleanor signed the response immediately. Beatrice smiled, a deep, genuine expression of peace washing over her face. The transaction was complete. The most vulnerable connection in Marcus' life was now brokered by the shy waitress. Eleanor was no longer just efficient. She was indispensable, the quiet anchor tethering the boss to his humanity. Marcus stood up, signaling the end of the audience. The abrupt movement brought the crew back to full alert. To Eleanor, "You return to your post. For now we maintain the illusion of routine. But you are no longer invisible. Understand that this also means you are untouchable." Eleanor rose, feeling the silent mandate settle over her like a heavy cloak. "I understand, Marcus." She retreated, leaving the throne, but the barrier she had shattered remained broken. As Eleanor cleaned the espresso machine, watching Marcus prepare to leave with his mother and his crew, she understood the cost of her empathy. She had traded her anonymity for protection, and her quiet life for a front-row seat to the dangerous, intimate secrets of the town's most powerful man. Her greatest defense was now her greatest burden. Marcus pulled Beatrice's coat around her shoulders with a rare, gentle gesture. Beatrice gave Eleanor a discreet, grateful sign, a silent promise of camaraderie. Marcus looked once more at Eleanor, his intense blue eyes holding a complex mixture of warning, dependence, and grudging respect. He knew now that Eleanor Hayes carried the key to the only world he couldn't completely dominate, the world of family, emotion, and silent communication. He turned and walked toward the diner exit, his crew parting the patrons like a wave of cold water. Silas paused at the door, casting one long, bewildered look back at Eleanor before following his boss. The diner door closed with a firm click. The silence they left behind was different now. It was a charged, expectant silence. Eleanor went back to serving the mid-afternoon stragglers, but her world was irrevocably altered. The Copper Kettle diner remained brightly lit, worn and infused with the scent of coffee, but for Eleanor Hayes it was no longer a retreat. It was the precise center of an intricate silent web, spun not of crime or fear, but of necessity, and the quiet, potent power of a language spoken only by the hands. Her inner resilience had surfaced, forging an unspoken, dangerous contract with a man who now depended entirely on her unique, silent voice. The shy waitress was now the interpreter for the Mafia's heart, a position of leverage and peril she could never escape. The clatter of a dropped spoon in the back kitchen startled Eleanor, pulling her abruptly from the silence of Marcus' departure. The Copper Kettle had returned to its normal low hum of activity, but the tension left behind by the men in dark suits was a physical, oily residue on the air. Betty, the owner of the diner, a woman who usually operated with the gruff efficiency of a drill sergeant, approached the counter, her face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Betty was a pragmatic woman. She understood that Marcus' patronage was both a curse and an economic necessity for the struggling diner. Low strained. "What was that, Eleanor? I swear to God I thought he was going to—" Eleanor interrupted her, shaking her head almost imperceptibly, wiping down the already spotless stainless steel surface. She had to maintain the illusion of routine, the normalcy that kept the fear at bay. "It was fine, Betty. His mother is deaf. She needed help ordering." Betty stared, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She had watched the entire silent transaction, witnessed the absolute stillness of Silas, the intense focus of Marcus. "He made you sit with him, Eleanor." "Him? That man doesn't share air with the staff. You were talking to his mother with your hands." Eleanor avoided Betty's gaze, focusing fiercely on her task. The weight of Marcus' mandate, "You are no longer invisible," felt like a physical constraint. She hadn't just helped an elderly woman. She had inserted herself into the delicate, violent ecosystem of Oak Haven Springs. "I just translated. It was a simple communication." Betty finally retreated, recognizing the firm barrier Eleanor had raised. She knew better than to pry deeper into the affairs of Marcus Donovan. The secret remained hers alone, shared only with the man who now held her future in his grasp. Days bled into a strained, cautious routine. Marcus returned every day, always occupying the throne, but now the dynamic was entirely different. He rarely acknowledged Eleanor directly, unless Beatrice was present. When Beatrice did arrive, the transition was immediate. The crew, especially Silas, would stiffen, a mixture of annoyance and deference crossing their faces as they watched the shy waitress move confidently into the intimate space of the back booth. Silas, the massive, silent sentinel, was particularly uncomfortable. His loyalty to Marcus was absolute, built on years of shared risks and brutal efficiency. Yet Eleanor's presence created a blind spot, a weakness. She communicated essential information right under his nose, information he couldn't decipher, making him feel exposed and useless. He watched her hands with an almost hostile fascination, as if they held a physical weapon he couldn't disarm. One wet, dreary Tuesday afternoon, Marcus arrived without Beatrice. He was alone save for Silas and 2 perimeter guards. The diner was nearly empty. Marcus drank his coffee in silence for nearly 20 minutes, the only sound the hiss of the rain against the plate glass windows. Eleanor, moving slowly behind the counter, could feel the pressure building. This was a non-routine visit, and Marcus was waiting for something. Finally, Marcus placed his cup down, the sound sharp and final in the quiet space. He beckoned Eleanor over with a movement of his head, not a finger, a slightly more polite gesture acknowledging her new, elevated status. Eleanor approached, maintaining a professional distance. Quietly, intensely, "I require your service outside of this establishment. Now." The request, though expected, hit her with sudden force. The copper kettle was her fortress, the boundary between her safe life and his dangerous one. Crossing that line meant true assimilation. "Outside. Is Beatrice well?" "She is fine. She is agitated, however. She requires your presence at the keep. There are circumstances, complicated ones. Silas will escort you." Silas, who had been leaning against the wall, straightened to his full, formidable height. The thought of being alone in a car with Silas, bound for the Mafia boss's heavily fortified home, made the air feel thin. "My shift isn't over." A low, humorless chuckle. "Your shift, Eleanor, is now 24 hours a day, contingent on my mother's needs. Betty has been compensated tenfold for your absence. Gather what you require. You won't be returning tonight." The finality of the statement chilled her. She wasn't being asked, she was being deployed. She managed a single stiff nod. She went to the back, retrieved her worn leather bag containing a change of uniform and a book, and exchanged a swift, meaningful look with Betty, who could only offer a sympathetic, horrified shrug. When Eleanor returned, Silas was waiting by the door. He opened it, not with chivalry but with the efficiency of someone ushering a prisoner. The vehicle waiting outside was a long, obsidian-black sedan, unmarked, reflecting the grey sky. Inside, the leather was rich, the silence absolute. Eleanor was placed in the back seat, Silas riding shotgun. The driver a stoic man whose eyes met hers once in the rearview mirror, a brief, unreadable acknowledgement of her new position. The drive to the keep was a journey out of Oakhaven Springs and into another reality. The town's meager lights gave way to dense, manicured forest. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on her folded hands, the movement of the car the only indication of progress. Without turning, his voice a low rumble. "Understand your parameters, Eleanor. You are here because the boss requires you to speak to his mother. You see nothing else. You hear nothing else. You report nothing else. Quietly, I understand. No, you do not. You see a house. I see a battlefield. Every plant, every window, every servant has a function. Your function is translation. If you deviate, your protection ceases to exist." His words were not threats. They were statements of fact, delivered with the cold precision of a weapons manual. The vehicle eventually slowed, turning onto a private road shielded by massive iron gates that slid open silently. The keep appeared through the gloom, a stone mansion imposing and severe, built with the cold, enduring wealth of a man who needed to feel impregnable. Lights burned brightly in every window, defiant against the encroaching darkness. They stopped at the imposing front entrance. The driver opened Eleanor's door. Silas escorted her, his hand resting lightly, but commandingly, on the small of her back. The interior of the keep was luxurious, but sterile. Marble floors, heavy tapestries, and an air of controlled opulence that felt more like a museum than a home. It was Marcus' reflection, powerful, expensive, and devoid of warmth. They were led through a series of cavernous rooms until they reached a sitting parlor, warm with the scent of burning wood and expensive pipe tobacco. Marcus was there, standing by the fireplace, his posture rigid, but the focal point was Beatrice. She sat in a deep velvet armchair, her silver hair slightly mussed, her face etched with profound distress. A woman in a dark uniform stood respectfully several feet away, clearly having failed to calm the elderly woman. The parlor was suffocatingly quiet, but Eleanor immediately registered the emotional noise radiating off Beatrice. She was distraught, signing agitatedly to herself, her hands moving in quick, frantic patterns that spoke of fear and confusion. Marcus, seeing Eleanor, gestured sharply toward his mother, voice tight with frustration. "She's been like this for 2 hours. One of the staff brought her a newspaper, a local edition, not the one I screen. She saw something. I couldn't get the paper away before she saw it. She knows. Help her." Eleanor approached Beatrice slowly, kneeling down beside the chair, intentionally placing herself below the older woman's eye level to appear less threatening. She noted the crumpled newspaper lying on the floor, the headline obscured by a fold, but its presence confirming the source of the trauma. Beatrice looked at Eleanor, her expression shifting from panic to a desperate hope. "Beatrice, it is Eleanor. Your son asked me to come. What is troubling you? Tell me what you saw." Beatrice's hands flew up, trembling slightly, detailing the fear that had paralyzed her. "The article. The construction site collapsed downtown. They are saying it was an accident, but I know better. It was the same construction company my husband worked with before he disappeared. Before Marcus told me the trouble was finished. Are the troubles returning? Is Marcus in danger?" Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her. Marcus had told his mother that her husband's troubles were resolved. The implication, delivered in the safety of the diner, was that the rival or debt had been eliminated. Now that resolution was being questioned, and Eleanor was the sole mediator for a potentially lethal secret. The construction site collapse was clearly Marcus' business, a violent resolution wrapped in a cover story. She turned to Marcus, relaying the message as neutrally as possible, though the gravity of the translation was immense. To Marcus, low measured. She read about the accident downtown, the collapse. She connects the company to your father's old business. She believes the troubles are returning. She is very afraid for your safety, Marcus. Marcus' jaw tightened. He hadn't expected the collateral damage to reach his mother this quickly. He glanced at Silas, a sharp, silent order passing between them. Silas immediately moved toward the discarded newspaper, snatching it up and folding it away into his inner coat pocket, eradicating the physical evidence. Stepping closer, his presence overwhelming the small space. "Tell her this, Eleanor. Do not soften the words, but be precise. Tell her that the collapse was a necessary demolition, a cleansing of old rot. That company, and all those associated with her husband's past, are permanently removed from our operations. It is safer now than ever before. Tell her I ensured that there will be no future danger because the foundation of that old world has been destroyed." The phrasing was brutally honest, yet veiled in corporate language. Necessary demolition, cleansing of old rot. Eleanor understood. Marcus hadn't just resolved the problem, he had annihilated it. And he was commanding her to deliver this terrifying confirmation of his violence directly to his vulnerable mother, using the language of empathy as his weapon. This was the climax, the moment where her moral choice was tested. She could refuse to translate the lie brutal truth, or she could deliver the message and ease Beatrice's pain, accepting her role as an accomplice to reassurance. Eleanor took a deep breath, her own fear momentarily overshadowed by the fierce desire to protect Beatrice's peace. She turned back to the aging woman, her hands rising, firm and eloquent, translating not the exact words, but the necessary reassurance wrapped in Marcus' intent. "Beatrice, the event you read about, it was a final closure. Your son took measures to ensure that every problem connected to that past business and all those people were removed completely. It was necessary to clear the ground entirely. Marcus wants you to know that the foundation is new and solid now. There is no danger. You are completely safe within the keep, and he is safe because he has made his world secure." Beatrice watched Eleanor's hands intently, absorbing the complex message. The blunt, uncompromising truth hidden within the signs was clearer than any spoken word. She understood the cost of Marcus' safety and the price of her own peace. A long, silent moment passed. Beatrice reached out, taking Eleanor's hand in her own, squeezing it tightly. She looked past Eleanor, directly at her son, and signed a message of profound relief and quiet sorrow. "Tell my son that the cost of safety is always too high, but tell him I am grateful that he bears the weight, and that I finally feel the peace he fought for. Tell him I worry less now, knowing the rot is gone." Eleanor turned to Marcus, translating the raw, emotional content. To Marcus, softer than before, she said that the cost of safety is always heavy, but she is grateful that you bear it. She finally feels the peace you fought for. She worries less now, knowing the threat is completely eradicated. Marcus stood frozen. The sheer, naked gratitude filtered through Eleanor's translation hit him harder than the simple words. The transaction was complete, the high-stakes message successfully delivered. Eleanor had done more than interpret. She had validated his ruthless actions in the eyes of the one person whose judgment mattered. Marcus finally moved, running a tired hand through his impeccably styled hair. To Eleanor, his voice almost husky, "You did well." He gave a curt order to the attendant to bring Beatrice warm tea and a light sedative, if necessary, then dismissed her. He stood before Eleanor, the firelight catching the intense blue of his eyes. "You realize what you just translated, Eleanor? You realize you are now privy to the operational realities of my business. I translated the need for peace, Marcus. That is all I did. A dry, acknowledging smile. The need for peace. Yes, and that is why you cannot leave. You are more than a translator. You are an essential component of my mother's well-being, and you understand that her well-being is non-negotiable." He pointed to a hallway. "Silas will show you to the guest wing. You will remain here until my mother is settled and calm. You will be safe, Eleanor. Safer here than anywhere in Oakhaven Springs, because if anything happens to you, my mother suffers. And that is an unacceptable liability." Eleanor felt the full, crushing weight of her new reality. She was protected, yes, but held captive by her own empathy. Her untouchable status was a gilded cage within the keep. Silas stepped forward, indicating the path. "This way." As Eleanor walked down the hallway, she didn't look back at Marcus. She knew his eyes were on her. She realized the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer afraid of Marcus. She was deeply, profoundly wary of the power she held over him, the power to connect him to his humanity, or to cut him off entirely. The guest suite was unnecessarily grand, a stark prison of silk and dark mahogany. Silas remained by the door for a moment before closing it, his gaze reflecting the continued confusion she inspired. She was the one anomaly in his perfectly ordered, violent world. Left alone, Eleanor changed into the clean uniform she had brought, the familiar practical spectacles resting on the bedside table. She looked out the enormous window. Below, the sprawling, manicured grounds of the keep were dark, shrouded in the unrelenting rain. She saw the flash of perimeter lights and the occasional movement of unseen guards. She was trapped, not by bars, but by a silent, invisible cord of necessity. That evening, Eleanor found herself eating a solitary dinner in the vast, echoing dining room, served by a nervous attendant who refused to make eye contact. Marcus joined her briefly, sitting opposite her at the enormous table, maintaining an awkward silence that spoke volumes of their new relationship, a forced intimacy born of necessity. "My mother is resting comfortably. Thank you. You are welcome." Leaning forward slightly, "You confuse me, Eleanor. You refuse the money. You speak a truth that others would hide. You have the access to destabilize my most sensitive connection, yet you choose loyalty to a woman you barely know. Why?" Looking directly at him, "Without fear, I choose empathy, Marcus. It is stronger than fear and more reliable than money. You chose to weaponize my instinct. I am merely using it to maintain the integrity of my actions. I will serve Beatrice honestly. That is all I promise." Marcus watched her, a slow, grudging respect replacing the cold calculation. He had underestimated her quiet resolve. She wasn't playing his game. She was defining a new one entirely, one based on moral leverage he couldn't challenge without hurting his mother. Rising from the table, concluding the meeting, "Understand this, then. While you are here, you are protected by the full weight of my security. Should you choose to leave Oakhaven Springs, should you attempt to run, that protection vanishes instantly. Your safety is contingent on your proximity to Beatrice. Do you accept these terms?" Eleanor knew she had a choice, a final, defining moment where she could reject the danger and attempt escape. But she thought of Beatrice's frail, expressive hands, the relief on her face, and the agonizing isolation she had endured. Eleanor's empathy, the very trait that led her here, prevented her from abandoning the old woman. "I accept. I will stay, as long as Beatrice needs me." "Then welcome to the keep, Eleanor. You are now the single most important asset I possess." He left the room, his silence swallowed by the cavernous mansion. The next morning, Eleanor woke early. The rain had cleared and the light filtering into the room was blindingly bright, highlighting the stark reality of her captivity. She was ushered to Beatrice's private sunroom. Beatrice was already there, drinking tea, looking calmer and more serene than Eleanor had ever seen her in the diner. When she saw Eleanor, a bright, genuine smile appeared. "I was hoping you would stay. My son does not know how to be gentle. You understand the quiet spaces. I am happy to be here, Beatrice. I will stay as long as you wish." For the rest of the day, Eleanor and Beatrice conversed, not about Marcus's dark business, but about gardening, old books, and the simple beauty of silent communication. Eleanor discovered the sharp, clever intellect hidden behind Beatrice's gentle facade. She was interpreting, yes, but she was also finding a genuine friendship, a human connection Marcus had never anticipated. That evening, Marcus observed them from the doorway of the sunroom, watching as Eleanor and Beatrice laughed together, their hands moving in rapid, fluid conversation. The light in the room was soft, domestic. For the first time, Marcus saw his mother genuinely happy, not just content, but communicating. He realized that Eleanor Hayes had not just become indispensable to his operations, she had accidentally become the most vital and therefore most dangerous element of his emotional life. Her presence was a constant reminder of the vulnerability he had to protect. He signaled Silas, who stood watch nearby. To Silas, low enough so Eleanor couldn't hear, "Ensure her protection is absolute. Double the guards on the guest wing perimeter. She is not to be disturbed, touched, or questioned by anyone but myself. She is the linchpin. If she is compromised, my mother is compromised." Silas nodded, his expression still bewildered but entirely obedient. He understood force. He now had to protect an entirely new kind of power, the silent power of a shy woman's hands. The copper kettle diner remained brightly lit, worn, and awaiting its new dynamic. But Eleanor Hayes would not be returning to serve coffee in the immediate future. Her spectacles, once a shield, were now a symbol of her clarity. She had accepted her role as the reluctant translator, the necessary bridge, fully aware that her silent language held the balance of power, forcing the Mafia boss to confront the one thing he could never control, the tender, unyielding connection between a mother and her empathetic interpreter. Her quiet life was gone forever, replaced by the perpetual high-stakes drama of Marcus Donovan's heavily protected world, where her voice, though silent, spoke louder than any threat. She was no longer a shadow, but the essential anchor, and she finally understood that in Oakhaven Springs, true power resided not in the gun, but in the language of the human heart. The story of the shy waitress had ended. The tale of Marcus Donovan's silent interpreter had just begun, binding her fate irrevocably to the keep and the secrets it guarded. Loved this? Give the algorithm proof. Subscribe and drop a like.